Hello and welcome to the third video looking at The Woman in Black for AQA GCSE English Literature Unit 1 Exploring Modern Texts. And in this video we're going to look at choosing and answering the examination question in the exam. You have a choice of two. I've got two here from the previous exam of June 2012, and I'm going to go through how to break it down and how to begin your answer. I'm not going to put a full answer on. Maybe we might do that later on, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through how to analyse the question, how to understand what you're being asked to do, and then basically how to structure your response. So looking at this question here, question 7, it asks, how do you think Hill creates sympathy for the character of Arthur Kipps? If we look at the question and consider what we're being asked to do, it's quite clear that the examiners want us to think about characterization and Susan Hill's use of language. You've got to show how and why Hill has created such a convincing picture of her first person narrator Arthur Kipps. It's how she uses language to convince us of his character, to convince us of his situation, his loneliness, his feelings of loss, his fear, and make us believe in Arthur as a character and want to find out what happens to him throughout the story. This is what the word sympathy means. It means that even though we can't put ourselves into his position, we can be actually understanding in relation to the situation he finds himself in. And Hill does this through showing us a development in the way he talks, a development in the way he sees the world, and a development in the way he changes from when the actual narration of the story starts, a rather naive, rational, arrogant young man, to someone who suffers, wants to find out the truth, and actually is a victim of forces he cannot control or understand. Of how Hill uses dramatic irony to keep the reader engaged, where the reader understands a lot of things are going to happen to Arthur, whereas the character himself is completely blind to those things. Of how she contrasts his relationships with other characters and the events, of how she builds up tension and expectation at certain points in the novel, such as in the nursery or at the end of the novel itself, The Pony and Trap, to keep the tension, the suspense and the reader's engagement up to a maximum. So as you can see in this little post-it here, it's quite clear what you're being asked to do. Moving on to looking at the next question, question 8 here, there's obviously more detail as you can see. And in question 8 what we have is really a focus completely on the use of language, figurative language and grammatical language by Hill to create impressions upon the reader. So in this sense it's a sense of terror for the reader. You're being actually asked to consider how Hill uses language and explore how she uses language to engage interest and generate fear in the reader as they read the end of the chapter in the nursery. So what you would do is you would focus on that part of the book. You would quickly reread it. You should really know it in the exam. When you go into the exam, you should know these key moments in the book, how they link to the action, how they link to the character, how Hill uses language in them, and how those different elements of the language are employed to gain the reader's interest and maybe even try to shock them. So you can see it moves slightly away from character, but character still plays a role in this question because, of course, as with everything else in The Woman in Black, it's all seen through the prism of Arthur Kipps' narration. So it's very important that we are always aware, particularly when being asked about fear or terror or anything to do with shock or not understanding that's going on. For example, when Kipps meets Mr. Jerome and then Mr. Jerome has his apparent breakdown, that it's the narration of Kipps and Kipps's character in particular where all of our reactions are centered. So in a funny sort of way, question 8 is a kind of reflection of question 7 about how we are sympathetic to Kipps and how Hill makes him convincing to us. So if we were looking at this question, we'd break it down. We know we're being asked to look at how Hill uses language, how Hill uses narrative, that's the story, how Hill presents her character to create this fearful set of events at the end of this chapter. So if we look, we would think about these things. So in your response, you would break it down, obviously, into a very quick list of these maybe 3 to 4 elements, which you would then go on to examine and analyse, say how and why these things are happening, how and why these things are effective, how and why Hill uses specific figurative language, maybe similes, metaphors, personifications and so on, to make an effect upon the reader whereby they would be shocked or surprised or fearful, even if they were reading this book in the dead of night, maybe in their beds with a little lamp on or by candlelight. So in this response you need to identify Kipps's role in the narrative and how his thoughts and reactions play a role in building the tensions and expectations in relation to the nursery. So for example, the fact that he hears a strange noise in there and can't place it. He's not fearful, he's just puzzled. That's one thing that begins to drag the reader into the story and builds a sense of tension and suspense. Of course, by this time in the novel, or novella rather, Hill has introduced the character of Spider the dog, who reacts in a hypersensitive way to the events in the house, and from that we actually have Kipps's reactions to Spider's behaviour, which again creates interest, causes the reader to find out what that might be, thinks about the fact that animals are supposed to be able to see these supernatural things that human beings cannot, and then of course worry about Kipps, because obviously his tendency is to rationalise these feelings and to try and give a rational explanation, again causing maybe confusion in the reader as to why he's trying to do that, or frustration, and read on to find out what the outcome will be. And then of course there's this idea of the tension and foreshadowing used by Hill regarding the nursery, that it's a place that Kipps can't get into, that seems to be always locked, the only place that doesn't have a key. What's behind the door? Again, what we don't know about causes fear, causes tension. And then finally, when Kipps actually does get into the nursery, how Hill describes that strange set of sensations that Kipps seems to feel when he's in there. The fact that he's almost possessed by the feelings of the woman in black. So you can see then, there is a sense of terror created, but it's mainly through the character of Kipps. There are different language features used to do this, but if you think about these 4 main areas of that part of the chapter, and the fact that Hill has built these up for the reader, creating tension and suspense, what will happen to Kipps, what will happen to Spider, what's behind the door, and so on. These are classic horror elements that Hill then uses to develop a feeling of fear and strangeness in the novel that will make the reader read on without being too scared to read on, and be interested to find out what happens to Kipps and his dog. So you can see then that these questions are basically focused on Arthur Kipps's narration, because all of the book is to do with Arthur, how well Hill actually generates that character, creates sympathy for him, creates an understanding for him in the reader's mind, and finally asking you to write down your opinions as to whether these elements are actually effective, and whether they would make a reader want to read on and find out what happens to Kipps in this novel.